Hello, my name is Agata Paszka and I am a graduate student of philosophy at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. It is my utmost pleasure to present to you this series of interviews with Professor Michael Devitt, a distinguished professor of philosophy at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Over the years, Professor Devitt has published numerous books and articles, most notably on issues in philosophy of language, metaphysics, and philosophy of biology. These interviews, conducted during Professor Devitt's visit to Krakow in November 2024, center around three topics. The first one concerns Professor Devitt's philosophical development and the origins of his ideas, beginning with some early reflections from the time preceding his post-secondary education, for undergraduate and graduate training, all the way to the early period of his career which followed the completion of his PhD studies at Harvard University. The second topic concerns realism and naturalism, two guiding principles not just of Professor Devitt's metaphysics, but of the entirety of his philosophical thought. Issues concerning language, broadly construed, constitute the third topic. By discussing some of these key themes from Professor Devitt's philosophy, we strove to connect his ideas regarding many philosophical problems, often seemingly far removed from one another, whilst also acknowledging the crucial changes which occurred between his subsequent theoretical proposals. Without further ado, here's our conversation. Enjoy. So one of the key contemporary debates concerns the distinction between semantics and pragmatics. Do you think it's important to try and find the principled basis for this distinction? And if so, how do we do that?
Yes, I think it's terrifically important, and it's something that it's a distinction that presses in on you as soon as you start thinking about language, and I have to confess that I didn't seriously address it until quite recently. Well, I suppose I started to address it more, not so recently, with Donnellan's distinction stuff. So yes, utterances have meanings, they convey a message, and we're tempted to suppose that, and you might say the tradition supposes, that for the most part the meaning that is thus conveyed in an utterance is the meaning that the sentence in the utterance has as a sentence in the language. But it's long been familiar that there's more to it than this. First of all, you've got the problem of disambiguation. That is, sentences in the language are often ambiguous. Suppose the utterance is, he went to the bank. Well, the word bank is ambiguous between a financial institution and the side of a river. So what the utterance means depends not just on the meaning of the sentence in the language, it depends on which meaning. And that's going to be settled in context. And then you can have the argument as to how it's settled. I think it's settled by what's going on in the mind, and I think that's the right thing. But then there's another problem with what we hankered after, which is, what about the word he? It, of course, has a meaning in the language, but the meaning in the language doesn't fix the reference. The reference is fixed in the context. So you immediately have to add, to explain the meaning of the utterance, you have to not only look at the meanings of expressions in the language, you have to take account of the reference of indexicals, which are settled in the context, and disambiguation. All of that was well known in the tradition. And then this very exciting movement came along, sometimes called the linguistic contextualism, sometimes called linguistic pragmatism, and there are lots of extremely interesting work has been done there. The locus classicus here is Sperber and Wilson's book, Relevance. I think it was called Relevance. Yeah. Hundreds of lovely examples which are alleged to show that what utterances mean is much more determined by the context rather than the semantics than anyone had ever thought. That's what I responded against, and I have argued in my book Overlooking Convention that these lovely examples that the pragmatists have produced are mostly, in fact, really almost all, to be explained semantically, not pragmatically. That roughly we need to expand the amount of convention, we need to expand our picture, our theory, of the amount of conventional language there is, which can explain this. So I'm basically defending the sort of somewhat traditional view, that the traditional view being that the content of an utterance, usually, because everyone knew there were novel utterances, the content of an utterance is to be explained by it being an exploitation of the language. That is, by the conventions of the language and certain disambiguations and ambiguities. That old view I'm trying to defend, basically, by expanding the idea. There are more ambiguities than we thought of, and there's more reference fixings than we thought of. If you think of that simple sentence, he went to the bank, everyone knew that we needed to disambiguate bank. I'm saying, particularly focusing on polysemy, I'm saying that this phenomenon is much more widespread than has been acknowledged. Polysemy semantic polysemy is everywhere. And reference fixing is much more widespread than just the well-known indexicals. For example, here's a lovely example in the context the pragmatists emphasize. It's raining. Well, if I were to say this now, I would probably be meaning it's raining in Krakow now. But I didn't say that, or so the pragmatists would say. The meaning that I uttered didn't say that. It's fixed in the context. And I say, yes, indeed, it is fixed in the context. But in fact, there is a demand for saturation here, just like there is with an indexical he. You've, as it were, got, if you like, an indexical element to this, which is not revealed on the surface. And that's all part of the semantics. So I want to save the tradition by expanding the amount of ambiguity and the amount of reference fixing against so that's my positive view, and I'm defending a traditional sort of view against the pragmatists, and I have some criticisms of the pragmatists. Do you want me to go through? So
I just wanted to ask, so a lot actually turns out to be the job of semanticist, right?
Yes,
not of the pragmatist.
That's what I'm saying, and this of course does go against what they think.
Yeah.
I mean, really extreme pragmatists, Charles Travis, for example, sort of argue as if there's hardly anything for the semanticists to do. It's nearly all pragmatics. Yeah. So it's nearly all, as it were, made up on the moment. And he and others have got lots of lovely examples which they use to try and establish this. And I aim in my book to deal with these examples and show that they're all semantic.
Right. Yeah. So I want to focus on the three methodological flaws that you discussed extensively in Overlooking Conventions.
Yes.
Well, let's start with the first one, appeals to intuitions, right?
Right. Well, that's sort of now in our discussion getting a bit boring because the linguistic pragmatists, like everyone else in the philosophy of language, and indeed like the linguists, rely on their intuitions. And they're pretty upfront about it. Particularly, there's a lovely upfront remark from an absolutely excellent, terrific linguist, Robyn Carston, where she just says, this is what we're all doing. And I've got another lovely quote from Stephen Neale of this. So, yes, I, of course, just as I reject appealing to referential intuitions, I reject appealing to semantic intuitions here as a basis for settling anything. How should we do it? Well, it's the old story again, test usage. And here, it's actually easier to test usage than it is when you're testing theories of reference. As our experiments with testing theories of reference have shown, it's hard. But in the semantic pragmatics dispute, the key way to test what is it about usage that is going to be most revealing of whether an expression, whether an utterance is to be handled, whether its meaning is to be explained semantically or pragmatically. The most revealing bit of the usage is regularity. If you get an expression being regularly used with a certain speaker meaning, or putting that another way, regularly used to express a certain thought or part of a thought, that is very persuasive evidence, not conclusive, very persuasive evidence that you have a convention in the language of using that expression with that meaning. And if you have a convention, then you have a linguistic rule. So the steps run: regularities, evidence for convention, establishes a rule, causes a rule. Where you have a convention, you have a rule. So you end up, it is a linguistic rule that this expression means this.
Yeah, well, this just proves to show just how widespread the method of appeals to intuition is, and philosophy
and how it can. And you see, and the good thing about regularities, they're much more easy to detect.
Right.
Just to repeat what I said a minute ago, trying to show test theories of reference against usage, hard business. The claim that I made, and we were talking about earlier, and other people made, that what Donnellan was talking about, identifying with his referential uses, was a referential meaning, not just a referential use. That is supported by regularity. Definite descriptions are regularly used they're regularly used with a certain speaker meaning. The speaker meaning being something determined in context, as exemplified with the table. Indeed, not just that, they're more regularly used this way than any other way. Referential, so I claim, this is an empirical claim about usage. There's the most regular use of definite descriptions is not the Russellian usage, but referential uses. And that's not hard to test. But actually you don't need to test it because it's obvious to everyone who thinks about language. So testing theories against, testing theories in this semantics versus pragmatics thing is sort of much easier because regularities are easy to detect. That's how I proceed, yeah.
So let's move on to the second flaw, which is the conflation of the metaphysics of meaning with the epistemology of interpretation.
Right, yes. Yes, so what we're getting at is, with these flaws, so I've given a positive view, but the negative things that I had to say, which are critical of what's going on in linguistic pragmatism, is captured by these three flaws, and we've done. So the second one, as you said, is this. It's almost universal, with some very notable exceptions, for people in the semantics pragmatics debate, particularly on the pragmatic side, when they're arguing about meanings and whether the meaning is to be captured semantically or whether it's to be captured pragmatically, it's almost ubiquitous in the debate for people to look to how someone interprets. How does the audience interpret the utterance? And the inference is made in this, that this somehow shows, is determinate of what the utterance means. And this seems to me to be a really crucial flaw of this debate, and I'm not alone in thinking this. Most notably, Kent Bach has been saying this sort of thing for years, and Stephen Neale has said it, and Jerry Fodor and Ernie Lepore have said it, but that's about people you can put on one number in one hand, and we're almost alone. So the standard practice is to make this mistake of taking facts or alleged facts about the interpretation of an utterance as somehow constitutive of what they mean. Mm-hmm. What is constitutive of what they mean, that is the metaphysics of meaning, oversimplifying, it's what the speaker is doing, not what the interpreter is doing. The interpreter has an epistemological problem, hence the epistemology, trying to figure out what the speaker meant. That's an epistemological problem. But what the speaker does mean is constituted by what the speaker does. It's constituted by what conventions the speaker is participating in, which of course is a social thing. But it's which one is, what makes it the case that bank in he went to the bank means on this particular occasion the side of a river is what was going on in the speaker's mind. And nothing else matters, so I would argue. What makes it the case that the utterance referred to this particular man, in using the word he, was what was going on in the mind of the speaker. Of course, something that's going on in the mind of the speaker which links, causally but perceptually links him to that particular man. That's what constitutes the meaning. The conventions of the language and these mental states which are grounded in the outside world. That's the metaphysics of meaning. And then the hearer has the task of interpreting it. It's a different matter altogether, and it can be done well, it can be done bad, it can misunderstand, but none of it is constitutive of what the expression means. And when you're trying to figure out where to stand on the semantics pragmatics of a certain term, it's a bad mistake to start looking, or looking only at least at how people interpret it. Indeed, how people interpret it at best could provide you some evidence, but even that seems to me to be often not the case. So that does seem to me, and this is a almost universal flaw. I give dozens and dozens of examples of this flaw. And then the third flaw is perhaps more important again, which is linguists and philosophers are driven by the acceptance of a certain view which is most neatly characterized by Paul Grice and named modified Occam's razor. Very, very neat, very witty. He takes Occam's famous saying, entities are not to be multiplied beyond necessity, and Grice so neatly says, senses are not to be multiplied beyond necessity. And this seems to carry with it, this maxim seems to carry with it the authority of Ockham. And I am very devoted to Occam's razor. So if that Gricean maxim is understood as the original Occam's razor is, or at least ought to be understood, then I would embrace it. So let's go to the original Occam's razor. How should we understand? Well, we should understand Occam's razor, and this, for example, is how Quine would understand it, and Quine, of course, is terribly Occamist. Do not posit entities if explanation does not demand it. So if you've got a situation, this is very central to the Quinean view, if you've got a situation which you're trying to explain, and that of course is the standard situation you're in science, you're trying to explain the situation, and you have the idea, oh, I can explain this situation by positing a certain entity, perhaps an unobservable entity, and if I posit that entity, I can explain this. Well, what Ockham is warning us is, don't posit this entity to do this explanatory unless you have to. What does that amount to? It amounts to, well, let's see if we can explain this phenomenon perfectly adequately without positing that entity. And if we can, then we should prefer the explanation that does not posit the new entity. because that new entity is not necessary for explanation. That's the way to understand, it seems to me. This is a sort of Quinean way of understanding what Ockham did, and it's absolutely central to my approach to metaphysics. Okay, all of that's good old Ockham. Modified Occam's razor, I think we should draw just the same sort of thing. So if you understand modified Occam's razor as saying, do not posit senses where you do not need to posit one, sorry, do not posit a new sense, let's say, where you do not need to posit it to explain the phenomena. Absolutely, I agree with it. Fine. But that isn't the way it's used. It isn't the way modified Occam's razor is construed in the literature. It's construed like this. Do not posit a sense if we can come up with a pragmatic derivation of the meaning. And I deliberately chose this vague we. Who's the we here? Well, it's the theorists. So we alleged, the guiding driving force in pragmatics is keep out meanings by supposing that we can explain, we theorists can explain the meaning in the message. We can explain it pragmatically. We don't have to suppose it's a meaning. This seems to me to be a very bad principle. A very bad, it leads to quite inappropriate meaning denialism. That we theorists can come up with this is really beside the point. For the pragmatic account to be right, it has to have this derivation, has to have a place in the human mind. If, as a matter of fact, it's a bit subtle, this, but if, as a matter of fact, speakers are supposing, in saying this, that hearers will go through this derivation to understand their remark, and if hearers, as a matter of fact, are going through this derivation to understand the remark, if that were the case, then indeed we should take the pragmatic explanation. And my general argument is we have no evidence that this is the case in all the interesting cases. And there are lots of reasons to think it isn't the case, and there's lots of reasons for thinking that what is in fact going on in language production of these things is the familiar old practice, whatever it may be, because we don't know the details, of selecting an item in the lexicon and producing it, that sort of thing. And in the interpreter, the familiar old practice of taking an expression that has been uttered and processing it as an item in the language. So I think this modified Occam's razor, as usually construed, has led to a totally uncalled for preference for a pragmatic explanation of phenomena over a semantic preparation. An example, apart from, there was a very interesting book by, is he a linguist or a philosopher? I'm not sure. Ruhl, R-U-H-L, which is built also around this sort of meaning denialism. He has a thesis which is what he calls the monosomy bias. We should always be biased in favor of monosomy. We should do almost anything we can to avoid positing more than one meaning. We posit just one meaning, and then we see all the various uses as being pragmatic modifications of the one meaning. I see this as theoretically totally unmotivated.
So what's next? Putting it all to a test?
Not sure what you mean. You mean testing it empirically?
Yes.
Well, I claim in my book that all my proposals are empirical. Because what is the empirical test? I mentioned it at the beginning. The empirical test is do we have a regularity of an expression being used to express a certain speaker meaning? If we have that regularity, then that's an empirical question. If we have it, then we have evidence for a convention and hence evidence for a rule. Now, that I did say, if you have the regularity, you have evidence for the, but for God's sake, regularities can often, well, sometimes at least, be explained other than by supposing there's a convention. That's where modified Occam's razor, properly understood, comes in. You shouldn't posit a new sense if you can give an explanation of the new regularity, as if you can give an explanation that's at least as good of the regularity that does not posit the new sense. I agree with that, definitely. But this is all empirical. So I see the test has already been. And as I said, it's not that I went out. We've already talked. I and many others are busy trying to test theories of reference empirically. But the key things with the semantics pragmatics thing is you really don't need to test. It's an empirical question whether there are the regularities, but basically everyone agrees there's a regularity. There's a real methodological flaw here, that people are going the wrong, confronted with the regularity, instead of going semantic, they're going pragmatic. So the regularity is not in question. I mean, no one, just take what we were talking about a minute ago, it is raining. There's no one out there on any side who disagrees with the claim that it is raining, normally is used to speak a mean that it is raining at a certain place at a certain time. It's an empirical claim, but it's so obvious that people don't challenge it. So in the semantic pragmatic thing, the empirical stuff is in a way easy.
So since the role of pragmatics is supposed to be, well, diminished, I mean, to a great extent, a lot of it has to do with
semantics.
With semantics.
Yes.
Why do we sort of need that distinction anyway? Is there anything left?
Yes.
So to say,
there's still
right?
plenty left for pragmatics. There's just things that have always been uncontroversially pragmatic. Metaphors, one's favorite example. And metaphors provide me with my main argument, in fact, against modified Occam's razor. I think that's right. I'm just thinking it's being. So metaphor, think of a metaphor. What is a metaphor? Well, it's at least partly constitutive. It's partly constitutive of a metaphor that what you speak and mean by what you say is different from what it literally means. If that weren't the case, you wouldn't have a metaphor. So that's an example of pragmatics. Novel uses of language are uncontroversially to be understood pragmatically. And metaphors are sort of novel uses of language. But what's interesting, of course, about metaphors is that they die, which itself, by the way, is a metaphor. One of my students pointed out to me that, so the metaphor dies and you have a dead metaphor. And one of my students delightfully pointed out to me that dead metaphor is a dead metaphor. And what do you mean when you say it dies? You mean that the metaphor, what was previously a metaphor, has become conventionalized. How did this happen? Very simple story. Someone comes up and uses an expression metaphorically. Other people are charmed by it and use it metaphorically, and it's, as it were, still a metaphor, but then it becomes something that everyone's doing, and then you have a new usage. What has happened is the metaphor has developed into a regularity, and the regularity is developed into a convention, and then you have a new rule. So and one of the key argument against Ockham, modified Ockham's razor is, I like to put it this way, it would make modified Ockham's razor, as typically construed, would make metaphors immortal. Because as typically construed, the view is that we should not posit a new sense if we can derive the meaning from the old sense. And remember I said, what about this we here? It's we theorists. And with a dead metaphor, you can nearly always derive the old meaning, the new meaning, from the old meaning. That is, metaphors don't come from nowhere. A metaphor involves a pragmatic derivation. That is, how do you get the meaning of a metaphor? Well, you derive it pragmatically. You take the literal meaning of the expression and you think, oh, well, what the speaker must mean is something different. She's being very clever here. So that's how you get the metaphorical meaning from the speaker meaning is by, from the conventional meaning is by derivation. And of course that derivation was how it got going in the first place. And we theorists can we either already know about it or we could discover it. But discovering the derivation of a metaphor which has now become a dead metaphor does not mean that the metaphor is still alive. If it was sufficient to show that you do not have a semantic meaning in question, if it was sufficient to show that you simply had to show there was a derivation, no metaphor could die.
Well, of course, that depends on the view of metaphors that you advocate for. I mean, you chose the sort of traditional view, which is, I mean, of course it's fine.
I meant to be fairly neutral, I thought, but anyway.
Yeah, but of course, you know, look to Davidson, for instance, or Stephen Yablo for different views of metaphors. But I mean, that's kind of beside the point. It's interesting to see that, well, you still hold that there are certain phenomena, certain pragmatic inferences that will never be reduced.
No.
To
novel
semantics.
uses will never be reduced to semantics.
So it starts as a pragmatic phenomenon and then maybe
becomes conventionalized, yes.
Right.
Right. And that bit of what I'm claiming should be uncontroversial. The only question, the controversial bit is the particular things I'm claiming it's already happened to.
Right.
But you see, what's an issue between me and the pragmatists here is not novel uses of a language. We all agree that's pragmatic, but the pragmatists are pointing to and even emphasizing regularities and then insisting they're pragmatic.
Right. Okay.
There are the famous examples, I think Travis made these famous, about colors. That's a red grapefruit. That's a red apple. That's a green leaf. Well, the green leaf could mean it's naturally green, as it were, or it may be because it's been painted green. And the grapefruit is red, not because of its outside, but because of its inside. The apple is red because of its outside. So you've got all these lovely variations. I see them all as rule-governed polysemy, systematic polysemy, so all semantic. Yes.
Right. So, do you want to? I mean, you've gotten into that debate quite late because the book is from 2021, right? And I wonder if you want to sort of do some further projects in this sort of pragmatics, semantics, pragmatics realm, or do you think that it's kind of your view has been already established? And
I'm sure I'm never have the illusion that any of my views is established. Oh God, that would be...
I'm just wondering what the next step is, you know, because you say that, well, we don't need empirical tests. It's as if the theory is out
Well, I'd say it's empirical, but
you said it's
because the tests are obvious. That is, it's not in dispute. The empirical facts, the empirical claims on which I am basing my semantic claims are not in question.
Right.
If they were in question, we'd go and test them, yeah. If I say that there's a regularity and people say no, there isn't, well, then we should certainly test it. Yeah. So there are lots of things we know about the world empirically. In fact, nearly everything we know about the world empirically does not come from scientific tests. Mm. We know it because it's, as it were, before our eyes. You know. We know about the regular use, the regular referential use of definite descriptions without having to go out and take a sample. You don't look as if you believe me. Sitting in our armchairs, we can marshal the empirical facts. It's important to see that you bring to the armchair an awful lot of empirical knowledge.
Well, but I guess then experimental semantics is threatened, right? Because someone might argue, well, maybe we know a lot. As you said this about your experiment on proper names, that since you claimed that it proved that the intuitions of Kripke were right, then there is a real worry here.
Yeah. Well, I didn't think there was a real worry, but as I said in talking about intuitions in the beginning, if you think of intuitions as I do, as empirical judgments about the world, then whether or not you should rely on them depends on how reliable you think the intuitor is. And I thought that on these issues, Saul was astonishingly reliable. And you get some confirmation he's so reliable in that people didn't contest his intuitions. That is, in his ignorance and error arguments, he says that we're all able to, well, educated people at least, we're all able to refer to Cicero and to Catiline, even though we're ignorant. We couldn't give a definite description of Catiline or Cicero, most of us, but we refer to it. That's an intuition. Saul had the intuition that we're all referring with Catiline and Cicero. And he gave a whole lot of other examples. And the intuition is irresistible. One of the reasons it's irresistible, it's very easy to see. Saul's claims about a few names which he gave could be generalized. And I've generalized it into a claim like this. Most words out of most people's mouths, most proper names, out of uses of proper names, out of most people's minds, are of names where the person is ignorant or wrong about the referent. So this is not just a side issue. It's almost the whole institution of using names is accompanied by ignorance and error. And this sort of makes Saul's point irresistible. Do you want to say that none of us are referring using names, or hardly anyone? That, in fact, it's really rather a rare event when someone uses a name and succeeds in referring. That is a very bizarre claim. Only a philosopher could probably make it. But I don't know of any philosopher who has made it. That is, faced with what Saul said, that people said, oh no, I'm afraid you're wrong. You don't refer to Catiline. You don't refer to Cicero. Oh no, and these ignorant people don't refer to Einstein when they think that Einstein invented the atomic bomb. People didn't say that. And these are people, because everyone believed in the description theory at that point, but faced with Saul's stuff, those people who were description theorists did not come back at him and reject his intuitions. What they did was try to construct description theories that avoided this ignorance and error problem. So yes, I think that Saul's views were so, that's, well, at least to me, I'm not saying this is a scientific, I don't say, I'm critical of intuitions being relied upon. You should also be critical of people relying on Devitt's opinions about intuitions. But I'm just saying that's why I had this view that testing was actually not going to be terribly illuminating. I was so confident we would confirm Saul.
And similarly, you're confident that your insights in pragmatics would have been confirmed were we to conduct some tests.
I'm not saying that. I'm confident about my claims of regularity.
Right, the claims of regularity.
Which
That's
are
what
the
I meant, actually.
empirical basis for the claim, the empirical test.
Right.
I mean, what I'm doing with my pragmatic semantics stuff is taking uncontroversial claims of regularity and showing that this establishes, this is enough to support the semantic view.
Right. Yeah, I think we've run out of time.
And if we don't,
we are running out of storage space, so
yeah, we're done.
All right, let's stop. And if we don't stop now,
no,
Agatha,
we are
you will have
stopping.
worked me to death.